A folded slip of heavy cream paper slid silently beside her wine glass. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, hurried ink. 3 sentences that would destroy the evening. Pretend you're sick and leave now. 10 minutes later, the front doors flew open and the one woman he feared most walked in. The dining room of the Harrington estate was a masterpiece of manufactured suffocation. Clara Davenport sat perfectly still, her spine a rigid line against the mahogany backing of her chair. The air in the room was thick, layered with the cloying scent of roasted pheasant, melting beeswax candles, and the heavy, musky perfumes favored by women who had too much money and too little to do. Around her, the conversation was a dull, rhythmic roar. Lord Harrington was droning on about the corn tariffs, his jowls shaking with the effort of his own self-importance. To her left, a young viscount whose name she had already forgotten was aggressively dissecting the latest horse races. Clara smiled. She nodded. She offered the obligatory, polite murmurs right on cue. It was a survival mechanism honed over 6 years of navigating London's high society, on the frayed edges of a baron's dwindling fortune. She was 26. In this world, that made her practically a ghost. Unmarried, unwealthy, and dangerously observant. Across the sprawling length of the table, seated in the place of honor beside Lady Harrington, was Alistair Cavendish, the Duke of Westford. He was looking at his wine glass, tracing the rim with a long, calloused thumb. Clara didn't look directly at him. Doing so was a risk she had stopped taking months ago. But she didn't need to look at him to know exactly how he sat, shoulders tight beneath the flawless cut of his dark evening coat, jaw set in that hard, unforgiving line that meant he was bored out of his mind. She knew the exact shade of his eyes in the candlelight. She knew the rough texture of the skin at his wrists. She knew entirely too much about a man who belonged to someone else. They hadn't spoken in private since the autumn leaves turned out at his country estate 2 years prior. It had been messy. It had been brutal. It was the kind of quiet devastation that left no visible scars, but fundamentally altered the way a person breathed. Alistair had a dukedom on the verge of bankruptcy and a family name to uphold. Clara had her pride and an absolute refusal to be kept in a townhouse as a well-compensated secret. So he had done what men of his station did. He secured an alliance. He was engaged to Genevieve St. John, a woman whose dowry could buy half of London and whose family possessed the political influence to rule the other half. Clara took a slow sip of her claret. It tasted like ash. She turned her attention back to the Viscount, preparing to ask a meaningless question about a gelding, when a shadow fell over her shoulder. A footman in the Harrington livery stepped into the narrow space between her chair and the wall. He moved with the practiced invisibility of good domestic staff. Under the pretense of refilling her water glass, his white-gloved hand dipped toward the tablecloth. When he pulled away, a small, tightly folded square of heavy cream paper lay against the base of her wine glass. Clara's heart executed a single, violent thud against her ribs. She didn't reach for it immediately. She let her hands rest in her lap, her face a mask of placid interest. As the Viscount continued his monologue, her eyes flicked across the table. Alistair was no longer looking at his wine. He was looking at her. The physical impact of his gaze was staggering. It stripped away the noise of the room, the heat of the candles, the babble of the aristocracy. His expression was completely blank, but the muscle leaping along his jawline betrayed him. He gave a microscopic dip of his chin toward her plate, then deliberately turned his head to answer a question from Lady Harrington. Clara's fingers moved. She slid the note into the folds of her silk napkin, pulling it onto her lap. Beneath the table, out of sight of the glittering society that would crucify her for a misstep, she broke the waxless seal. The handwriting was jagged. Written fast. Written hard. Pretend you're sick and leave now. No signature. No explanation. Clara stared at the stark as black ink, A cold dread began to pool in her stomach, heavy and metallic. Alistair was not a dramatic man. He did not play games. He was calculating, pragmatic to a fault, and ruthlessly protective of the careful boundaries they had drawn between them since the engagement was announced. For him to send a note to her at a dinner party, risking the observation of 20 of London's worst gossips, meant something was severely, structurally wrong. Leave now. She looked up. Alistair was laughing at something the hostess said, but it was a hollow sound. His knuckles, where his hand rested on the table, were bone white. Clara did the math. Her carriage was in the mews. It would take the footman at least 5 minutes to bring it around. It would take another 3 minutes to make her excuses and retrieve her cloak. She had to move. She reached for her water goblet, her hand trembling just enough to be noticeable, and knocked it against her plate. The crystal let out a sharp, discordant ring. She pressed her fingers to her temples, closing her eyes tightly, forcing a shallow, ragged edge into her breathing. "Miss Davenport." The Viscount stopped mid-sentence, finally noticing her. "Are you quite well?" "I apologize, my lord," Clara said, her voice strained, pitching it just loud enough for the host to hear. "I am afraid I'm suddenly very unwell." The lie tasted sour on her tongue, but Clara played it with precision. She let her skin pale, not difficult, given the genuine adrenaline flooding her veins. She kept her eyes downcast, a woman terribly embarrassed by her own failing constitution. "My dear?" Lady Harrington leaned forward, peering down the length of the table with vulture-like interest. "Whatever's the matter? Is it the fish? I told the cook the salmon looked suspect." No, the food is exquisite, Lady Harrington," Clara murmured, pressing the napkin to her lips. She pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the parquet floor, a terrible sound in the sudden lull of conversation. "It is a migraine. It has come on with terrifying speed. I fear if I do not lie down in complete darkness immediately, I shall be a terrible nuisance to your lovely evening." "Oh, you poor thing." Lady Harrington waved a hand dismissively, already losing interest. "We cannot have you suffering here. Do you need a maid to assist you to a chamber upstairs?" "You are too kind, but I prefer my own bed. I will send for my carriage." Clara stood. Her knees felt unusually hollow. She did not look at Alistair. She couldn't. If she looked at him, someone would trace the line of her sight, and the fragile architecture of their mutual denial would collapse. "Allow me to escort you to the hall at least," the young Viscount offered, standing up and dropping his napkin. "Auditon, please do not trouble yourself. Enjoy the pheasant." Clara offered a weak, apologetic smile that brokered no argument. She stepped away from the table, her silk skirts whispering against the floorboards. The walk from the dining room to the hallway felt like wading through deep water. Every step was measured. She kept her hand pressed lightly to her forehead, playing the part of the frail, suffering woman, while her mind raced through a dozen catastrophic scenarios. Why did she need to leave? Was someone coming to the house? Was there a scandal about to break? She crossed the threshold into the expansive marble-tiled foyer. The air here was cooler, free from the oppressive heat of the dining room. "My carriage," Clara snapped at the lingering footman by the door, dropping the sickly pretense the second they were out of earshot. "Immediately. And my cloak." "Right away, Miss Davenport." The footman hurried off down the servants' corridor. Clara stood alone in the grand hall. A massive grandfather clock ticked against the far wall. The sound was deafening. Tick, tick, tick. 5 minutes passed. She paced to the window, peering through the heavy velvet drapes into the fog-choked London street. A carriage was pulling up to the front steps. But it wasn't hers. The vehicle was entirely too grand, a massive black lacquered thing with a crest painted in gold on the door. 4 matching grays snorted in the cold air. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The crest belonged to the St. John family. Genevieve. 10 minutes later. Alistair's timing was terrifyingly accurate. Genevieve wasn't supposed to be in London. She had gone to her family's country estate in Yorkshire for the month to oversee renovations on a property. Her arrival tonight was unannounced. It was an ambush. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Clara's chest. If Genevieve walked in and found Clara here, if she even suspected that Alistair and Clara had occupied the same room, the rumors would start before midnight. Genevieve was not a woman who tolerated loose ends or old flames. She destroyed them, systematically, socially, financially. If Genevieve targeted Clara, her younger sister's chance at a decent marriage next season would evaporate. They would be ruined. The heavy brass handle of the front door began to turn. Clara spun around looking for an exit. The servants' corridor? Too late, a maid was already coming up the steps bearing her wool cloak. The dining room. She couldn't go back. The massive oak doors swung open, letting in a biting gust of winter wind and the smell of rain. Genevieve St. John stepped into the foyer. She was a vision of terrifying, aristocratic perfection. Dressed in a traveling gown of deep emerald velvet, not a single hair of her elaborate updo was out of place despite days on the road. Her features were sharp, cut from marble, with pale blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. The footman scrambled, bowing deeply. Genevieve ignored them, handing her leather gloves to a maid without looking at her. Then she stopped. Her gaze locked onto Clara, standing frozen by the staircase. The silence in the hall stretched tight, like a violin string about to snap. "Miss Davenport," Genevieve said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of warmth. It didn't echo. It simply commanded the space. What an unexpected pleasure. Clara dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands. She forced her chin up. She forced her spine straight. She could not look like prey. "Lady Genevieve, we were not expecting you in town." "Clearly." Genevieve's eyes did a slow, sweeping appraisal of Clara's pale face and tense posture. She stepped further into the light of the chandelier. "I finished my business in Yorkshire early. I thought I would surprise my fiancé. Is he inside?" "He is," Clara said, keeping her voice incredibly even. "Enjoying the pheasant, I believe." "And you are leaving." It wasn't a question. Genevieve's eyes dropped to the maid holding Clara's cloak, then flicked back to Clara's face. The blue of her eyes hardened, a predator calculating a weakness. "Before dessert? How tragic. Is the company not to your liking?" "A sudden migraine," Clara lied smoothly, stepping forward to take the cloak from the maid. She swung it over her shoulders, the heavy wool providing a pathetic armor against the woman in front of her. "I am entirely unfit for society tonight." "A migraine." Genevieve smiled. It was a terrifying thing, that smile. It didn't reach her eyes. She took a slow, deliberate step closer to Clara. The scent of her expensive Parisian perfume cut through the cold air. How dreadfully convenient. "You know, I have always found that sudden illnesses are rarely physical, Miss Davenport. They are usually symptoms of guilt. Or fear." Clara held her ground. She didn't blink. "I assure you, my lady, my head is simply pounding." "I am sure it is." Genevieve leaned in, dropping her voice so the lingering servants couldn't hear. Her words were laced with poison. "Let us be perfectly clear. I know what you were to him, and I know what you are now. Nothing, a footnote. Run back to your little rented rooms, Miss Davenport, and the next time you find yourself in the same dining room as my future husband, do not wait for a migraine to excuse yourself. Do not attend at all." Genevieve straightened up, smoothing her velvet gloves. She stepped past Clara without another word, moving toward the dining room doors. Clara stood shaking in the foyer, the cold wind from the still open front door biting at her cheeks. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the stiff, crumpled cream paper. Alistair hadn't just been protecting his own peace tonight. He had been protecting her. "Your carriage, Miss Davenport," the footman murmured, appearing at the doorway. Clara stepped out into the dark, pulling the cloak tight around her throat. The game had just changed. and she was already losing. The Davenport townhouse in Bloomsbury smelled of damp wool and cheap coal. It was a sharp, bitter contrast to the beeswax and roasted meats of the Harrington estate. A reality check that hit Clara the moment she crossed the threshold. She paid the carriage driver with hands that were still trembling, though she was no longer sure if it was from the cold or the residual adrenaline of Genevieve St. John. The front door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the damp London night. Inside, the house was entirely silent. The single maid they could afford was already asleep in the attic. Clara hung her cloak on the wooden peg in the narrow hall and walked into the drawing room. A fire was dying in the grate, reducing to sullen orange embers. Curled on the faded chintz sofa was her younger sister, Louisa. Louisa was 19. She possessed the kind of état-perfect, soft, uncomplicated beauty that Clara had traded for sharp edges years ago. A book had fallen onto the rug beside her dangling hand. Clara stood in the doorway, watching her sister's chest rise and fall. This was what she was fighting for. This was the reason she endured the thinly veiled insults at dinner parties, the recycled gowns, the constant, exhausting mathematics of survival. Louisa deserved a chance. She deserved a decent match, a home that didn't draft in the winter, a life free from the suffocating anxiety of poverty. If Genevieve destroyed Clara's reputation, Louisa's would shatter alongside it. The aristocracy was a hive mind. They did not punish the sinner alone. They burned the entire family tree. Clara stepped to the fireplace, picked up the iron poker, and viciously stabbed at the embers. The sudden flare of heat did nothing to warm the ice in her veins. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the crumpled square of heavy cream paper, and stared at it in the dim light. "Pretend you're sick and leave now." Alistair had known. He had recognized the exact moment the trap was sprung. A sharp, rhythmic tapping broke the silence. Clara froze, the poker still gripped tightly in her hand. The sound wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the tall, narrow window at the back of the drawing room, the one that looked out onto the cobblestone mews. She didn't breathe. The tapping came again, 3 sharp raps against the glass. Setting the poker down softly on the hearth, Clara moved across the room. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the faint pool of moonlight spilling across the floorboards. She reached the heavy velvet curtains and pulled them back a fraction of an inch. A figure stood in the narrow alleyway. The fog was thick, swirling around the hem of his dark greatcoat, but the broad line of his shoulders was unmistakable. Alistair. He was insane. Being seen here, in the dead of night, outside the home of an unmarried woman, it was social suicide for her, and a catastrophic breach of his own ironclad rules. Clara unlocked the sash and pushed the window up just enough to speak. The winter air rushed in, biting at her face. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. "If anyone sees you, let me in, Clara." His voice was rough, carrying a desperate edge she hadn't heard in 2 years. "No." She gripped the window frame. "Go back to your fiancé. You've done enough tonight." Alistair stepped closer. The moonlight caught the harsh angles of his face. He looked exhausted. The composed, bored Duke from the dinner table was gone, replaced by a man stretched entirely too thin. "She went straight to my study," he said quietly, ignoring her refusal. She didn't stay for dessert either. She brought documents from Yorkshire, things she wasn't supposed to find. If I hadn't seen her carriage pulling up to the Harrington estate, she would have walked right into that dining room and gutted you in front of 20 people. Clara swallowed hard. "She did gut me, Alistair. In the foyer, she told me I was a footnote. She threatened me." A muscle jumped in his jaw. He rested one gloved hand against the brick wall beside the window. "I told you to leave." "I did. It takes time to conjure a carriage out of thin air." Clara leaned closer to the gap, the anger finally bubbling up through the fear. "Why is she doing this? We have given her nothing. We haven't been alone together in 24 months. You bought your little alliance. You paid the price. Why is she hunting me?" Because she isn't hunting you, Clara. She's hunting me. He looked down at the cobblestones, then back up at her. The truth in his eyes was ugly and bleak. Her father is hemorrhaging money. The St. John fortune is a facade built on terrible investments in the East India Company. She needs my title to secure credit from the crown, and I need whatever liquid capital they have left to save the dukedom. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. It's a merger of two sinking ships, but she's paranoid. She thinks I'm looking for a way out. She thinks I'm going to break the engagement and run back to you. Clara stared at him. The sheer weight of the mess he was in settled over her. Are you? No. His answer was immediate, cold, devastatingly practical. I can't. If I break the contract, my tenants starve by winter. I have 300 families depending on the Westford estate. I will not let them rot. Then why are you here? She demanded, her voice cracking. If you are marrying her, if nothing changes, why are you standing in my alley? To warn you. Alistair reached through the open gap of the window. He didn't touch her, but his hand hovered inches from her cheek. The heat radiating through his leather glove was a phantom comfort. Genevieve is going to try to force my hand. She wants to prove I still care for you, so she can use it as leverage in the marriage settlements. She's going to make your life a living hell to see if I step in to protect you. Clara didn't pull away from his hand, though every instinct told her to run. And will you? If I do, she ruins you both. Alistair slowly pulled his hand back, retreating into the fog. You have to be a ghost, Clara. Do not react. Do not fight back. Let her think she has won. If she realizes you are a threat, she will crush your sister just for the sport of it. He didn't say goodbye. He simply turned and vanished into the damp darkness of the mews. Clara stood by the open window until the cold seeped into her bones, listening to the fading sound of his boots on the cobblestones. She slowly lowered the sash and locked it. Be a ghost? She looked over at Louisa, who shifted in her sleep, burying her face deeper into the cushions. Clara walked back to the fireplace and picked up the poker. She wasn't going to be a ghost. Ghosts couldn't protect anyone. The St. Jude Charity Bazaar was London's premier arena for polite, bloodless warfare. Held in the sprawling assembly rooms of Hanover Square, it was ostensibly an event to raise funds for orphans. In reality, it was a battleground where social standing was bartered, destroyed, and elevated over cups of weak tea and overpriced embroidered handkerchiefs. The room was a suffocating sea of pastel silks, feathered bonnets, and predatory smiles. Clara navigated the crowd with Louisa, trailing half a step behind her. It had been 4 days since the dinner at the Harringtons. 4 days of agonizing silence. Keep your chin up, Clara murmured to her sister, stopping at a stall selling terrible watercolors. Smile at Lady Jersey, but do not initiate conversation. Let her come to you. Louisa looked terrified. Clara, half the room is staring at us. They are staring because they have nothing better to do. Let them stare. Clara handed a coin to the vicar's wife manning the stall, receiving a watercolor of a lopsided spaniel in return. She didn't care about the painting. She cared about the optics. They were present. They were calm. They were contributing to the orphans. But Louisa was right. The atmosphere had shifted. The subtle mechanics of ostracization were already in motion. When Clara approached a group of matrons, the circle miraculously closed. When she caught the eye of the young Viscount from the dinner party, he abruptly found the ceiling architecture fascinating. Genevieve's poison was working fast. Well, well, the Davenport sisters. The voice sliced through the hum of the crowd. Clara turned slowly. Genevieve St. John stood near a display of imported lace. She was flanked by 3 women who operated as her personal guard. Wealthy, mean, and utterly devoted to whoever held the most power. Today, Genevieve wore a day dress of pale gold that practically screamed money. Clara felt Louisa stiffen beside her. She subtly stepped in front of her sister, offering a flawless, empty curtsy. Lady Genevieve, a pleasure to see you supporting such a noble cause. Oh, I always support the unfortunate. Genevieve's pale blue eyes flicked to Louisa, assessing the girl's mended muslin gown with surgical precision. It is a duty for those of us with means. Tell me, Miss Davenport, did your sudden migraine abate? It did. Thank you for inquiring. Clara kept her voice light, bored even. She refused to play the victim Alistair wanted her to be. I am so glad. Genevieve took a step closer, leaving her sycophants behind. The air around her smelled heavily of roses and malice. Because London can be so terribly taxing on a fragile constitution. In fact, I was just saying to the Duchess of Richmond that perhaps the countryside would be more suitable for a girl of your sister's delicate prospects. It was a direct threat. Leave London, or I will ensure your sister never marries. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of polite confusion. How kind of you to worry. But Louisa thrives in the city. We intend to stay for the entire season. Genevieve's smile tightened, the edges growing brittle. She did not like being defied, not by someone who owned a single decent pair of gloves. How brave, Genevieve purred. But bravery can so easily turn into foolishness. You must be careful, Clara. You do not have the armor required for a real war. Oh, before Clara could answer, a subtle shift occurred in the room. The ambient chatter dropped in volume, replaced by the collective intake of breath that always accompanied true power entering a space. Clara didn't have to turn her head to know who it was. Alistair walked into the assembly room. He looked immaculate in a dark blue coat, moving with that predatory grace that made other men look clumsy. He didn't look at Clara. He didn't even glance in her direction. He walked straight toward Genevieve. The social chessboard snapped into sharp focus. Genevieve's attention broke from Clara. She turned to her fiancé, her brittle smile transforming into a display of possessive triumph. She reached out, placing a proprietary hand on Alistair's arm, claiming him in front of 300 watching eyes. Alistair allowed the touch. He smiled down at her, playing the part of the devoted future husband flawlessly. Clara watched them. The pain was there, a dull ache in her chest, but beneath it, her analytical mind began to churn. She remembered Alistair's words in the alley. Her father is hemorrhaging money. She is paranoid. She thinks I'm looking for a way out. Genevieve wasn't strong. She was terrified. Her cruelty wasn't an execution. It was a defense mechanism. She was bleeding out financially, desperately clinging to a duke who didn't love her, terrified that a penniless baron's daughter might steal her only lifeline. Clara realized then that running away would only validate Genevieve's fear. If Clara vanished, Genevieve would assume she was hiding out of guilt. The only way to survive a paranoid predator was to prove you weren't a threat, not by cowering, but by changing the game entirely. Clara turned to Louisa. Come, darling. There is someone I want you to meet. Ignoring Genevieve entirely, Clara walked directly across the room toward an older, formidable woman sitting alone in a wing-back chair near the tea service. Lady Agatha Thorne. She was deaf in one ear, famously vicious, and held more social capital than Genevieve could ever hope to buy. She also despised the St. John family over a land dispute from 2 decades ago. Clara approached the old woman and executed a deep, respectful curtsy. Lady Agatha, I was hoping I might introduce my sister Louisa. She has just finished reading your nephew's treatise on botanical gardens, and she simply will not stop talking about it. It was a blatant, calculated lie. Louisa didn't know a botanical garden from a turnip patch, but Lady Agatha's eyes lit up with predatory interest. She glanced across the room at Genevieve, then back to Clara. When the old woman understood exactly what was happening. Did she now? Lady Agatha patted the empty chair beside her. Sit down, girls. Let us discuss foliage, and tell me exactly why that St. John creature was looking at you as though you tracked mud onto the carpet. Clara sat, smoothing her skirts. Across the room, Genevieve's face had gone a dangerous shade of pale. Alistair was still beside her, his expression utterly blank, but his eyes met Clara's over the sea of feathered bonnets. A ghost couldn't survive this war. Clara was going to build an army. The trench warfare of London society lasted exactly 3 weeks. Clara did not fight with rumors. She fought with geography. She placed Louisa precisely in the lines of sight of the right patrons. She poured tea for Lady Agatha. She became an immovable, polite fixture in the drawing rooms that Genevieve St. John desperately needed to control. Paranoia is a heavy thing to carry. Genevieve was carrying it in front of a critical audience. The strain began to show. Her laughter at the opera grew a fraction too loud. The emerald velvet gowns looked less like armor and more like costumes. She was a woman holding a fraying rope, watching Clara stand perfectly still, doing absolutely nothing to cut it. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, under the suffocating heat of the Royal Opera House. The air in the upper corridors smelled of gaslight, spilled champagne, and the nervous sweat of the aristocracy. Clara had stepped out of Lady Agatha's box during the intermission, seeking the relative cool of the deserted hallway. She was leaning against the brass railing when the sharp, frantic click of heels echoed off the plaster walls. Genevieve did not look perfectly curated tonight. A heavy diamond necklace sat crookedly against her collarbone. The pale blue eyes were entirely feral. She stopped 10 feet from Clara, her chest heaving. "You think you are exceedingly clever," Genevieve said. Her voice was a low, ugly hiss that bounced off the vaulted ceiling. "Hiding behind a deaf old woman, parading your pathetic sister around as if you belong here." Clara did not move from the railing. She looked at the diamonds. "I belong wherever I choose to stand, Genevieve. You belong in the gutter." Genevieve reached into the beaded reticule at her wrist. Her hand was shaking. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, the edges worn soft from handling. "Do you know what this is? I found it locked in the drawer of his desk at Westford. It has your name on it." Clara's blood ran cold. The air in her lungs simply vanished. "It is quite descriptive," Genevieve whispered, taking a step closer. A frantic, victorious smile stretched across her face. "He details exactly what it felt like to have your hands in his hair. He talks about the night at the hunting lodge. If I give this to the broadsheets tomorrow, your sister will not just be ruined. She will be a pariah. No respectable man will ever speak to a Davenport again." Clara stared at the paper. It was a ghost from 2 years ago. A piece of reckless honesty Alistair had written when they still thought they could beat the system. Genevieve was holding a loaded gun, but Clara had spent 3 weeks studying the chessboard. She saw the fatal flaw in the threat. Clara pushed off the brass railing. She didn't retreat. She stepped directly into Genevieve's space, forcing the taller woman to tilt her head down. "Do it," Clara said softly. Genevieve blinked. The manic smile faltered. "What?" "Give it to the broadsheets." Clara's voice was dead calm. "Publish it. Ruin me. But ask yourself what happens the day after. If you prove the Duke of Westford is a compromised, scandalous liar, his remaining creditors will panic. They will call in his debts. He will lose the estate, and if he loses the estate, he has no collateral to secure the crown loans your father desperately needs to avoid debtor's prison." Genevieve went completely rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving her chalk white under the gaslight. "You are holding a match in a powder keg," Clara said, her tone devoid of pity. "If you burn me, you burn him. If you burn him, your family starves. So go ahead, Genevieve. Hand it over. Let us all burn together." The silence in the corridor was absolute. Genevieve's hand dropped slowly to her side. The paper crumpled in her fist. She was trapped, and for the first time, she truly realized it. She is absolutely right. The voice came from the shadows near the staircase. Alistair stepped into the flickering yellow light. He wore evening black, his stark white cravat the only relief in the darkness of his attire. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were locked on Genevieve, and they were merciless. He held a thick, leather-bound book in his right hand. A bank ledger. Alistair, Genevieve breathed, instinctively taking a step backward. I know exactly what you were doing, he interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet register. He walked up to her and held out the ledger. A messenger arrived from the East India docks an hour ago. The Harbinger sank off the coast of Ceylon. There was no insurance on the cargo. Your father's last investment is sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Genevieve let out a small, strangled sound. The St. John accounts are empty, Alistair stated, delivering the killing blow with surgical precision. You have no dowry. You have no leverage. If I marry you tomorrow, I take on £90,000 of your father's debt. It would break my estate in a week. You signed a contract, Genevieve whispered, her voice cracking, tears finally spilling over her lashes. You cannot break it. A contract predicated on a dowry that no longer exists is void. Alistair reached out and plucked the crumpled love letter from her numb fingers. He slipped it into his coat pocket. Go home, Genevieve. Pack your trunks. The creditors will seize your townhouse by morning. Genevieve stood frozen for 5 agonizing seconds. She looked at Alistair, then at Clara. There was no fight left, only the hollow, terrifying reality of a fall from grace. She turned and practically ran toward the stairs, the heavy emerald velvet dragging against the floorboards. The corridor went perfectly still. Clara exhaled, leaning heavily against the wall. Her knees felt like water. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Alistair didn't close the distance between them immediately. He tossed the heavy ledger onto a nearby velvet bench. It landed with a dull, final thud. Are you all right? He asked roughly. I am entirely sick of this city, Clara said, dropping her hands. She looked at him. He looked exhausted, older than his years, carrying the weight of a dukedom that was still teetering on the edge of the abyss. You are still bankrupt, Alistair. You didn't save yourself. No, he agreed, finally closing the space between them. He stopped inches away, the heat of him a sudden anchor in the drafty hall. I am going to have to sell the London properties. I will have to lease the hunting lodge. We are going to live on boiled mutton and root vegetables for the next 5 years. Clara looked up into his eyes. The aristocratic mask was gone. He was just a man, backed into a corner, offering her a ruined kingdom. My sister stays with us, Clara said, her chin tipping up in a challenge. Alistair let out a short, rough laugh. He reached up, his gloved hand catching a stray curl of hair that had escaped her pins, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. Lady Agatha can come too, for all I care, he murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. Just don't leave the dining room next time. Clara closed her eyes. The gaslight flickered. For the first time in 2 years, she could finally breathe. And that brings our historical drama to a close. If Clara's brilliant counter-move and Alistair's ledger drop had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our upcoming story series. What was your favorite moment of this tactical takedown? Let me know in the comments below. Share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely intelligent romance, and I'll see you all in the next story.